Hello, we are Owlthorpe Fields Action Group, and we spent the last 3 years fighting a planning application to build houses on an area of land in Owlthorpe, South East Sheffield, an area that has been rewilded for 20 years and used as a valuable community green space. Our video is going to take you on a journey through the murky waters of the UK planning system and highlight the successes, failures, pitfalls and lessons we learnt along the way in our efforts to prevent shocking destruction of this important ecological area. This was Owlthorpe Fields in May 2021, a lush green expanse of trees, shrubs and wildflowers, with many invertebrates, birds and mammals using the area to live or forage. It's lovely, isn't it? This is Owlthorpe Fields in October 2021. Doesn't look quite so good now, does it? The area has been cleared of all vegetation and wildlife to make way for housing. A barren wasteland, the homes and foraging territory of the local wildlife eliminated in a matter of days. The ribbons were tied to the fence by local people to show their distress at their beloved area being decimated. To give you some idea of the variety of wildlife we've got here in Owlthorpe, here are just a few of the trail camera videos that we've taken over the last few years. We have many more, and they're far more than you can see here. Come on, I mean, who wouldn't want to say these little guys? How did it come to this? What went so wrong to allow a valuable natural asset, helping to fight climate change at no cost and all self-set, to be willfully destroyed and replaced by concrete, tarmac and housing? To understand this, we need to travel back in time to the 1960s. Back in the 1960s, the land was in the Greenbelt and had for many centuries been used as arable farmland. Sheffield Council removed it from the Greenbelt and allocated it for housing in the Sheffield Unitary Development Plan and Core Strategy, the two documents which dictate everything that happens within our city. Much of the area surrounding Owlthorpe, such as Hackenthorpe and Mosborough, was built on in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, leaving just Owlthorpe Fields untouched. The council divided the Owlthorpe land into 5 areas, A to E, with the intention of building on them all. In 1999, building started on sites A and B of the fields, and a small development was built. This left just sites C, D and E remaining. You can see on this image from 1999 how the land was all arable fields before the roads and housing were started, the roads cutting through the previously greenbelt land. By 2002, the development on sites A and B of Owlthorpe Fields was complete. At that time, everyone expected further development to take place on the 3 remaining sites, C, D and E, and would have accepted it at this stage. But the council left the land. They left it for almost 20 years, and the wildlife and flora and fauna moved in and flourished. Trees started to self-set close to the ancient woodland and gradually spread inwards. Wildflowers re-established themselves. Badgers, foxes and birds of prey started using the area for foraging. Smaller birds started nesting in the now lush habitat. In short, the biodiversity had increased massively in the last 20 years of rewilding. What started out as fairly low biodiverse arable fields had turned itself into a rich habitat for flora and fauna, through the natural process of rewilding. These hundreds of cell-set trees throughout the sites were sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, a crucial natural process which helps slow down global warming. They were doing this free of charge, with no cost to the council or the public, just stood there, benefiting the entire community and the wider population of Sheffield, the UK, the world. In 2018, the council put the land up for sale. By this time, people in the local area had begun to use the fields for recreation, dog walking, running, relaxation, exercise, wildlife and bird observation. It had become a valuable local community green space, important for their mental and physical health and well-being, due to the beautiful area it had become. Later, this became even more important during the COVID pandemic lockdowns. The community were not happy. They didn't want this area destroyed that they had watched rewild for 20 years and watched the gradual increase in wildlife which they had come to know and love. There were plenty of brownfield sites throughout Sheffield that could be built on first. In fact, the council had made a commitment to focus more development in the city centre and on brownfield sites. Owlthorpe was neither of these, being 8 miles from the city centre and a greenfield site. So, in response, a group of enraged locals got together and formed a campaign group, Owlthorpe Fields Action Group, with the aim of fighting the development. The OAG committee set about understanding how to object to developments, something none of them had any previous experience in. We read through Sheffield Council policies, national policies and planning law. This was a massive undertaking, and this is one of the major stumbling blocks for local communities fighting developments. The amount of legislation and policy is overwhelming for community groups. We are a small group of individuals with no expertise in planning or law. In contrast, the council and the developers have dedicated teams with many years' experience working in these areas. Reading through all the planning documents, it became very clear that the ecological value of the land had been grossly underrated by the ecologists, and much of the wildlife and flora that we locals knew to be there had not been recorded during the ecologists' visits. Even though the badgers and barn owls used the site for foraging and hunting, the policies and law did not consider this of any consequence in terms of development, and so it was dismissed. Wildlife doesn't have a voice. It can't speak up at planning meetings like we do, and doesn't recognise a red boundary marked on a map. And so we felt compelled to speak up for them. Not being ones to give up easily, we stepped up our campaign, encouraging the community to put in objections. Over 280 objections were submitted, along with a 900-strong petition. We contacted a large number of organisations, including Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, Campaign to Protect Rural England, the Woodland Trust, People's Trust for Endangered Species, our local councillors and MP, and many more. We joined Twitter, something us Wrinklies had never used before, and followed other campaign groups and high-profile individuals with links to nature and climate issues. This was a real eye-opener for us and proved a very useful move. We also started a Facebook and Instagram page to spread the word even further. Following a meeting with Sheffield Council, our local MP and others, we did manage to achieve one early success, with Sheffield Council agreeing to remove the remaining 2 sites from sale, temporarily at least. In June 2020, the Council held its monthly Planning Committee meeting via Zoom, and the Owlthorpe development was up for discussion on the agenda. All the OAG committee members spoke against the development at the committee, along with the Wildlife Trust, the Campaign to Protect Rural England, our local MP, and many others. So, you can imagine our ecstatic reaction when the planning committee rejected the development unanimously. Sadly, it wasn't rejected on either climate or biodiversity. Instead, it was rejected on the housing density and the plans failing to respond sufficiently to the area's green character. And this, as you will see shortly, had a tragic impact on the final outcome. Now, you're probably thinking, that's fantastic, what an epic battle, well done. But no, we knew we'd won the battle but not the war. But we were ready. At the recommendation of Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, we started recording all the wildlife, birds, wildflowers, trees, shrubs and grasses on the 3 sites of land, uploading them to the Wildlife Trust Nature Counts database, and holding a community bioblitz to increase the observations. We also commissioned our own independent ecological survey to compare with that of the developers. To try and secure further protection for the land, we gathered the required data for the Ocherdite Woodland and successfully applied to Natural England to get it officially designated as ancient. It will now permanently reside on Magic Maps. This has an impact on how close they can build to the woodland and places additional requirements on the developers to ensure they do not cause damage to the woodland. We also measured all the large trees in the Ocherdite Woodland and recorded all the required information to have them designated as either veteran or ancient in the Woodland Trust Ancient Tree Inventory. In total, 26 trees were confirmed and registered on the inventory. There was a method in our apparent madness in doing all this. We were preparing for the expected next move by the developers. Housing developers are very wealthy and very powerful organisations, and if a planning application is rejected, they have the right to appeal, and they frequently do. As expected, the developers did appeal, and we now had an even bigger battle on our hands, because the developers can afford very expensive and vastly experienced lawyers who do this for a living and have been doing it very successfully for many years. We, on the other hand, had no money and no experience, but we did have a shed load of passion and commitment and a lot of people supporting us. If we seriously wanted to try and save this rewilded area, we urgently needed to raise money, and quickly, as our only chance of success was to go to the public inquiry as something called a Rule 6 party. Put simply, this is a group of people with an interest in the site that isn't the council or the developer. We needed funds for employing our own planning expert and lawyer. So we opened a bank account and set about raising money on GoFundMe. We produced a calendar to sell to our followers, comprised of photographs local people had taken of flora and fauna on the fields, and we set up stalls in Crystal Peaks and our local Asda to raise awareness. Having raised enough money to employ a planning expert, and our chairwoman had successfully managed to talk a lawyer into representing us pro bono, we set about preparing our case along with Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust. We cajoled into being our expert witness at the public inquiry. Our case revolved mainly around the ecology of the site and the adjoining 2 sites. The independent ecological survey we had commissioned had been assessed against the local wildlife site criteria, and all 3 sites individually were potential candidates for designation as local wildlife sites for grassland, a habitat the council themselves had declared a priority conservation habitat locally. The public inquiry was scheduled for early January 2021, but just 2 days before the start date, our lawyer tested positive for COVID and was unable to represent us at the inquiry. This was a significant blow for us, but we soldiered on. We had no choice. The public inquiry was a brutal, unpleasant experience. The developer's barrister, vastly experienced in public inquiries and planning law, manipulated all the arguments such that interpretations of Sheffield Council and national policies suited the developer's arguments. They dismissed all our arguments, professionally and truthfully explained by our expert witness from the Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, accusing OAG and the Wildlife Trust of contriving the data. We were severely hampered by not having our lawyer to help with our case. Despite the ethical principles of protecting wildlife, we could not compete. At the end of the day, it all boiled down to money. Who could employ the best lawyer to obtain their desired outcome? No one cared about the wildlife except us. Sheffield Council made no attempt to defend it on ecology or climate issues. The decision was received in March 2021. The inspector had allowed the developers to have the planning permission they wanted, all in the name of profit, with no concern for the local population, the wildlife, the environment or the climate. The overriding factor that had ultimately led the inspector to disregard any of our arguments, all of which he naively believed could be mitigated for, was that the site had been allocated for houses in the Unitary Development Plan and Sheffield Core Strategy, both of which are many years out of date. An important requirement of any local authority plan is that they must be able to demonstrate that they have a 5-year supply of housing land. The number of houses is set by central government. If the council can't demonstrate this, the developers can almost build where they want. Although Sheffield Council could demonstrate a 5-year housing supply, Owlthorpe was included within this allocation. However, at the time the sites were allocated for housing, little attention was paid to climate change and even less attention given to the declining species. Currently, the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. In short, the world, and that includes Sheffield, was a far different place to when Owlthorpe was allocated for housing back in the 1980s. The National Planning Policy Framework, the planning policy that is supposed to guide all developments in terms of what they can and cannot do when they build, requires developments to achieve a biodiversity net gain. Clearly, this was never going to be achieved in Owlthorpe, considering the 20 years of rewilding that had occurred and the complete and utter devastation of the habitats on the site. The inspector who led the inquiry listened to all the arguments, but concluded in his final report that despite the fact that there would clearly be a biodiversity loss, this could be compensated for by a payment of £230,000 to be utilised to increase the biodiversity elsewhere. How would this monetary payment benefit the local wildlife who had lost their homes or foraging grounds? The UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. The State of Nature Report 2019 highlighted the decline of biodiversity in the UK. Wildlife habitat within the UK is becoming increasingly fragmented. Eventually, the isolated fragments will be insufficient and too far apart to support the existing wildlife. Such will be the case at Owlthorpe if the remaining 2 sites are built on. There will be nowhere for the wildlife to forage or live. You may think there are laws to protect wildlife such as badgers, barn owls and hedgehogs, but in reality they offer little if no protection. You often hear that badgers and birds of prey are protected, but once you start to delve into the muddy water of planning and wildlife, then the truth becomes evident. We have the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, which is supposed to protect our wildlife, but it doesn't protect them from developers and local authorities that have a housing allocation which they must meet as stipulated by central government. Take badgers for example. They are protected from being killed, but you can obtain a licence to shut down their set, where they live, and move it elsewhere. It doesn't matter if they use a proposed development site for foraging or for traversing to reach other areas. That is irrelevant. Poor things still have to eat. Another example is hedgehogs. They have declined massively since the 1980s, and the trend is still rapidly downwards, as this graph shows. We know we have hedgehogs here in Owlthorpe. We have seen them. Whilst this was recognised by the developer's ecologist, the mitigation plan was to include hedgehog highways. This involves cutting a rectangular hole in the gates or fences of houses to allow the hedgehogs a continuous passage through gardens and into their natural habitat under hedges and in the woodland. But the developers at Owlthorpe have dug the ground level so deep that there is a 20-foot drop from the existing footpath to the houses. So, unless the hedgehogs sprout wings or are supplied with abseiling equipment, they aren't going to be able to pass through their existing territory at all. The developer is also required to install bird and bat boxes on the houses, something which they have failed to do on previous occasions. But even if they do create hedgehog highways or install bat and bird boxes, there is no legislation that requires the homeowners to leave them in situ or not block them off altogether. So what of Owlthorpe Fields now? Fences appeared on site in May, and locals started tying ribbons and pictures to them, with messages expressing their grief and disgust at the impending destruction. Clearance of the site started in September. The sight of the enormous pile of hundreds of trees was devastating to witness, and shocking given that we are amidst a climate crisis. At the end of December, heavy rainfall resulted in the site becoming waterlogged and mud flowing down the road and into the Ochre Dyke, potentially putting the ancient woodland in jeopardy. So, reflecting on our journey to try and protect Owlthorpe Fields, let's look at local democracy with a short summary. Very few people in Owlthorpe and surrounding areas wanted development on the fields. Following a successful campaign, the Sheffield Council Planning Committee unanimously refused planning permission for the development. The developers went to appeal and won due to the skillful manipulation of planning laws and local and national policies. How do you feel that represents local democracy? Were the voices of the local people who live in the area really listened to? Were the genuine concerns for the health and well-being of the local community and the local wildlife population really taken into consideration during the course of this inquiry? Owlthorpe Fields Action Group have taken several messages away from this journey, which has armed us for our ongoing campaign to save the remaining 2 sites. As the planning system exists in its current form, the winners are those with the biggest pockets. The more money you have to spare, the better your chances of winning. The policies and legislation to prevent inappropriate development are easy to manipulate if you can afford experienced lawyers, because these policies and legislation are open to a multitude of interpretations, depending on what your objective is and how you can bend the system to fulfill your needs. Despite what we are led to believe, the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981 provides very limited protection to wildlife from development. Local democracy only exists in name. It can be stripped away by greedy developers and a planning inspector with no local knowledge and a remit to allow as much housing as possible with the stroke of a pen. The last 2, probably being the most important. Never underestimate the strength of the local authority plan. Sheffield's plan is years out of date. The Council is currently preparing a new one, and this is where our battle now lies. And lastly, never give up the fight. Stick to what you believe in and know to be right, however small the chances of success appear to be. So what does the future hold for Owlthorpe Fields? Well, there is hope on the horizon. Learning from these lessons, we are lobbying our local MP and Sheffield Council to remove the 2 remaining sites from the draft local plan. This is not now expected to be adopted by the Council until late 2024. Public consultation on the plan is currently scheduled to start in July 2023, so we need to be as vociferous as possible in the time remaining. We are pushing for the 2 remaining sites to be put before the local wildlife site panel and designated as such. This offers the first layer of protection to the sites, albeit limited. We are working with the Friends of Waterthorpe Park, Sheffield Council and our local MP Clive Betts on an S20 wildlife corridor. and looking to include the 2 sites, or at the very least some of them, into our corridor. We continue to record wildlife sightings and flora and fauna and report them to the Nature Counts database. Our foray into the world of Twitter led us on an unexpected journey. We soon came to realise that there are hundreds of other campaign groups throughout the country fighting similar battles. A number of these groups joined forces to create a support network called the Community Planning Alliance. The Alliance produced a map which any campaign group could add their name to. Owlthorpe Fields Action Group are now on this map. There are currently 556 groups on the map, and there will be many more that have not yet put their names to it. Above all, we have made some firm friendships along the way, and the lessons we have learnt on our journey have strengthened our resolve to go on fighting. Because nature has no voice of its own. We are the sole cause of nature's decline and for the global climate crisis. We are the only ones that can reverse the destruction of wildlife habitat. We have the responsibility and owe it to them as equals in nature to make it a place to be shared between man and the rest of the animal kingdom. We leave you to contemplate the fate of Owlthorpe Fields with a fitting quote by Professor Ian Rotham, a renowned authority on ancient woodlands and landscapes, from his book Shadow Woods. Professor Rotham has given us much guidance and support in our campaign over the last few years and continues to do so. The quote could have been written for Owlthorpe Fields, or indeed many other such greenfield sites in the UK. You may believe this small acreage matters little, but consider it as a microcosm. Consider if other similar habitats are treated with contempt masquerading as planning policy. Continual degradation in biodiversity in the UK will affect the lives of all our children and the wildlife, and on a global scale will result in the downfall of all living things on this earth. We couldn't agree more, and that is why we continue to fight for Owlthorpe Fields. Thank you for watching.